And then when you have questions, we won't record your questions. We will, keep everything private. So we'll just record this part and also make it available for YouTube for anybody who missed out on the presentation. So first of all, I want to welcome you all for coming. This presentation should be about 30, 40 minutes long. And we'll talk about some interesting topics. We'll talk about the dynamics of how crypto assets behave, options EMMs, our pricing model, our work, and our research. I would like to point out that everything that we present today is like a disclaimer. This is not, we're not here to sell you anything. We're just presenting our work and research. So that's the general gist. I want to make this interesting and educational, so I try to include charts and visualizations on each and every slide to kind of keep you guys, to convey the concept a bit easier. So I guess I'll start. So pods, so that's us. We're going to be talking at first about how crypto assets in general behave. And there's been some research that shows how crypto assets in general have a Hurst coefficient of greater than 0.5. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that if you look on the charts on the right, the top three, a Hurst coefficient is a kind of a coefficient that tells you if a process has the tendency to either correlate with itself, anti-correlate, or if there's no correlation. What does this mean? Well, it means if the price goes up, at the next event, does it have the tendency to go up or down, or is there like no correlation between it? Well, if you look at, for example, this chart, which you'll usually see in traditional financial markets like Forex, you notice that the Hurst coefficient is generally below 0.5, meaning once something goes up, it has the tendency to anti-correlate and go down, let's say, on the next day. So you witness this in Forex and stuff like that in traditional markets. So there's a property of mean reversion. And if you were to look at, for example, the distribution of the percentage changes of such an event, which is, in this case, these are just random simulations, you will see that it kind of forms a particular nice distribution, and there's a certain mean. It's nice and cozy, so to speak. When you look at a Hurst coefficient of 0.5, it's kind of like random. You don't know. There's no correlation between what's going to happen tomorrow and what happened yesterday, or today, sorry. And there, it's all over the place. But in the world of crypto, what you have is certain peculiar property. And research has shown that the Hurst coefficient with crypto assets is in general 0.5. So what does that mean? It means that if something keeps going up, it surprisingly enough has the tendency on the next event to actually continue to go up. If it goes down, it has the tendency to continue to go down. So sometimes you see something crash by 50% and when no way it's going to crash. Well, guess what? It's continuing to crash. Or if it doubles and it's like, no way it's going to double. Guess what? It's going to double. So there's a certain property to this. And the strange situation here is that if you look at the distribution of events that have a Hurst coefficient of greater than 0.5, such as crypto, and you look at the distribution of returns over this time, you witness these bizarre distributions. You have these huge tails on either increases or decreases, and sometimes even you have cases where the distribution itself winds up splitting. So there is no particular the mean, the median, and the mode, they don't really converge around a particular point. Sometimes you have these situations where it's all over the place. For example, if you were to look at a histogram of what happens to Bitcoin after a 20% down move in, let's say, one day, you sometimes witness these bimodal distributions where it splits. So this creates a highly problematic situation for people in crypto where you have these crazy distributions, crazy tails. So what could you do when you're interacting with such a stochastic process that's so just out of whack? Well, one of the things that you can do is you can use options to hedge such a stochastic process. So for those of you who are unaware, I will try to kind of quickly give an idea of the value of an option. So a put option gains value when something declines in price. So for example, it could be, let's say, Ethereum. So if Ethereum declines in price, goes further to the left, a put option would rise in value. And the most important concepts to grasp are that an option itself is made up of two value structures. The first one is an intrinsic value structure, and the second one is an extrinsic value structure. Intrinsic value structure, so for example, if a particular strike price exists, let's say the strike price is 10, and the underlying price moves to 8, then the intrinsic value would give you, let's say, 2. But at the same time, there's also a difference of 2. But at the same time, there's also additional value that is captured by the extrinsic aspect. And we're going to talk about those as we go. And what importantly happens to extrinsic value as time goes on is this phenomenon of theta decay. What does this mean? It means that extrinsic value shrinks as time goes on because options have a particular point at which they expire. So for example, let's use an extreme case to explain this concept. If tomorrow you bet that Apple will completely crash, it is much more unlikely that that will happen than if we say Apple will crash in, let's say, 20 years. Maybe it will crash in 20 years. Who knows? Maybe there's an earthquake in the Bay Area and their headquarters disappear and something like that. So the longer the time to expiration, the more extrinsic value there is. But as you approach the expiration point, the extrinsic value vanishes. And this phenomenon is known as theta decay, and this is why options lose value in general over time, the extrinsic value. To kind of get closer to this point and just run a simulation of, let's say, we create 10,000 different options. In this case, let's say it's Ethereum. The strike price is 3,000. Currently, the price is 3,000. It's expiring in, let's say, a month. And we can see that, let's say, on average, all the options, we have 10,000 different paths. Some might expire in the money, some might expire out of the money. Some might expire out of the money. So the underlying may move up or may move down. Well, in general, if you then take the average of all these paths and look at what happens to the value of such a put option across all the 10,000 different paths, in general, it has the tendency to decay and go down like this. And this is the phenomenon of theta decay. It is the vanishing of the extrinsic value as time approaches expiration. And what we use at Pods is we use a particular modified version of Black-Scholes. So I know the formula, some of you who are unaware of Black-Scholes may be a bit confusing, but I'm going to visually try and walk through with you on this one and try and explain how we use it. So, for example, a put option, in general, you can think of it as there's all these different components. They may be complex, but I think if I visualize it, you can more easily grasp what's going on. So the first component, the exponential of negative RT, is just the discount rate. And it's just in general, because the risk rate is set to 0, it plays no role in pricing options for the most part. And the two components, K and S, K is the strike price and S is the underlying. So this is what captures, so to speak, your intrinsic value. So to give an example, if we have a put option with a strike price of 10, K, and the underlying moves to 8, then the intrinsic value would be around here. And what happens with these other parts of the formula is you can think of them as being responsible for trying to capture extrinsic value for an option. And as time goes on, you can see that there's a couple of components, in particular time and sigma. And we're going to talk about those a bit. So what do we do to capture extrinsic value? But what we do with our option pricing approach is we allow implied volatility to float. Well, what is implied volatility? Implied volatility is this little term right here, sigma IV. So what does sigma IV incorporate? It incorporates, so to speak, the uncertainty of the movement of the underlying asset. So to better visualize it is, let's go back to our chart. And now let's for a second just ignore this little red over here, this intrinsic value, and just focus on the blue. But once we do that, the little n, so to speak, kind of looks like a distribution. So the n right here captures the distribution, D1 and D2 contain signals. So now let us increase the component of implied volatility. What happens? Well, it starts to expand. So the distribution starts to expand, and as the tails widen, we can capture more of these volatile assets. And that is in general what you observe also in traditional financial markets. That is also what you may observe in derivative, which is you have options and their implied volatility has the tendency in times of panic to increase. So for example, right now, actually a very interesting moment in time, you had China with an Evergrande, I think they're going to default or on their, I believe, bond. And that is also impacting crypto markets, and that's also impacting crypto derivatives. So what we do with our approach is we try to incorporate this change, this dynamic in implied volatility by allowing it to float. So what does this mean? It means in our AMM, we allow people to basically trade options, and as the options trade, the implied volatility changes. So before I get to that point, I just want to briefly talk about how implied volatility behaves in traditional financial markets, so you get an idea. And what we're trying to do with, so to speak, our approach is to have the implied volatility in traditional finance mimic very close to what it does in regular financial markets. If you look at this chart, for example, this is the implied volatility in traditional financial markets, in particular the VIX. In fact, today, I think it spiked, I think yesterday it spiked to like 30 or so. So as you can see, it has a certain property. It has a tendency to rapidly spike and then gently decline over time. And so basically it mean reverts, spikes and mean reverts. And this is kind of the property of the standard deviation that you observe in traditional financial markets. In the crypto equivalent to the VIX, which basically captures the implied volatility across all the options in, so to speak, the financial markets, in US financial markets, in the crypto world, we have something called the D-vol. So I think it's more related to Bitcoin, not necessarily Ethereum yet, but it captures also a similar dynamic as well. So what could we do? So the approach that Pods uses is it tries to kind of mimic this behavior. So let me kind of give you an example here of what we use. So our algorithm basically uses the Black-Scholes formula. Sorry, was somebody have a question? No? If you have a question, I just wanted to know, if you have a question, feel free to write it in chat. And if somebody, and somebody can help you answer. If not, I will try to answer them closer to the end of the presentation. But if it's like super important, you can ask them here as well. So what we have is we have a particular algorithm that responds to the buying and selling. And we internally refer to it as a Swedish method. It's a particular finite difference approach, similar to kind of what you might think of as the Newton method, if you're familiar with options, to solve for implied volatility. We use this thing called the Swedish method. And what it does is it solves also, it tries to calculate implied volatility. So what does it do? So first of all, every time a trade takes place, IV, implied volatility, is updated up or down. This results in a change in the price of the option. But as this algorithm evolves, what happens is, in order to initiate it, we have to at first estimate an IV. So if you look at the graph on the right in figure 7C, this is an actually interesting live example we had with a particular put option with Matic, is that in the very beginning, you would somebody would have to set and say, well, what is the implied volatility of this option? And for things like Ethereum and Bitcoin, it's pretty easy to do. You can go in Deribit and say, hey, Deribit, what's the implied volatility on Ethereum Bitcoin? I'll just say it's like 100% or something. Well, okay, so then you can just input, let's say, 100% on our AMM if you want to engage as an LP, and you could initiate the trading. And as the trading takes hold, what happens is the market starts to decide where exactly the IV should be. So if you underprice it, if you reprice it, these are the dynamics that takes place. But one of the things that we would like to do, and we intend to offer in the long run, is to be able to trade pretty much any ERC20 in the future. But for doing so, we want to be able to have an idea of what the initial IV should be. And since there's nothing to compare it to, like Deribit, where you can look at up Ethereum or Bitcoin, there's nothing for, let's say, Matic or Sushi or Chainlink or anything like that. So what would be an approach there? How would we initiate such an algorithm? And one of the things that we can do, and this is kind of an interesting method that at least we came up with, it's a very simple back of the napkin approach, is let's say you want to figure out the implied volatility for a new ERC20 that an LP, let's say, wants to sell. So here's kind of an interesting approach. What you can do is you can take, so to speak, the historical volatility, and you can observe that it in general approximately matches implied volatility. This is a phenomenon you can see in traditional financial markets. For example, if you look at historical volatility and, let's say, implied volatility, has a tendency to kind of follow. So there's a certain correlation. So if you guess what the initial implied volatility is, you can kind of mimic it across historical volatility. So as an example of how this approach could be used, let's see if the historical volatility of Apple is twice as big as that of Google. And we could use that ratio as a proxy for future implied volatility, assuming Apple and Google correlate. So for example, if to translate this in the concept of ERC20s, let's say we know the ERC20 of historical volatility of, let's say, Ethereum, and we know the historical volatility of Aave. And we know that there's a difference between them. Let's say it's 2 to 1, right? So historically, we just calculate the standard deviation. We say, okay, Aave is twice as volatile as, let's say, Ethereum. Well, we don't have any information on what the implied volatility is of Aave, but we know what the implied volatility is of Ethereum. So what we can do is we can roughly approximate and say, okay, most likely, initially, it's probably going to be twice as big. Implied volatility is probably going to be twice as big for Aave as it is for Ethereum. So all you need for our approach on the pods EMM is you just need one initial parameter, and that is the implied volatility. And what if you miss or accidentally don't guess it correctly? Well, in general, the market will simply correct it. So here's an interesting example. Previously, as you've seen, the LPs initially set their implied volatility for Matic at that time at about 275%. But the market thought, hey, you know what, maybe it's a bit higher. But then some people also sold, and as time went on, it kind of leveled off, and it seems to have the initial LPs kind of guessed it correctly. But even if you guess it incorrectly, the market adjusts and the market forces take over, and they take over this aspect of implied volatility to price the option. So what you can also do is you can extend this little back of the napkin calculation in case you want to sell an option on an ERC of an ERC20. You can extend it to all the different strike prices if you want to, let's say, compare it to Ethereum, and you can create this kind of a volatility surface. So, for example, if you want to create an option with a strike price of 400 expiring in 7 days, the implied volatility, for example, would be around 193%. So this is how you could extend, for example, this approach for guessing implied volatility in order to start the process if you have no clue what the implied volatility of an ERC20 should be. So this is just one of the approaches that we came up with. But of course, everybody can come up with their own model for guessing what the implied volatility initially should be. But the market will always just take hold and solve for it by itself if you either underprice it or overprice it. So to more concretely explain how on a more of a solidity level we process and this initial IV sigma and how it works is at the very beginning, our algorithm basically takes inputs. It takes the underlying asset spot price, let's say Aave or Ethereum. It looks up what the time to expiration is. It keeps track of it. At the very first instance, it's simply you have an initial sigma that you input, the initial IV, initial implied volatility. What's the strike price, which is a given. And then we have this little thing called Oracle IV boundaries. The only purpose of Oracle IV boundaries is to make sure that implied volatility does not go to 0 or infinity. These are just properties that just are not properties of the behavior of a standard deviation. And once these parameters are taken into account, we feed them into the Black-Scholes calculation, and we get a certain price. Once we get the certain price, if somebody wants to, let's say, if somebody buys more options, what happens is that they buy more options, the algorithm tries to guess using a finite difference method based on the changes in the price, what then the next IV would be. So for example, right here, you saw a huge spike. And then on the next event, you're trying to guess will be up or down. So you can think of it maybe as a time-weighted average process if you like to think so, if it simplifies the logic for you. But what it does is it uses a finite difference method to, due to the buying and selling, change implied volatility. And as it changes that implied volatility, it again feeds it back to the original, and the process repeats. And every time somebody interacts with the contract, to whether you buy or sell an option, it impacts the implied volatility. So, and we're going to go over a very interesting live example to show in more detail in a second. So at this stage, what I want to present is an example of how the AMM dynamics behave. It's going to be 6 charts. I will walk you through them to show a scenario, and then we're going to show a simulation of, let's say, 10,000 different paths and how we see the AMM behaving under different circumstances. So at first, let me just show 6 charts. I'll walk through each and every one of these, and we're going to look at a situation in which we have a put option, and we have a pool consisting of options and stablecoins. So people can buy options, sell these options, and we want to know how does the AMM behave. We want to look at certain important parameters. So at first, let's just look at the left, two graphs on the left. So these graphs just merely capture, so to speak, the dynamics of the option. In our case, we just have a very simple price of Ethereum is like 3,000, and let's say nothing changes. It's very simple, nothing changes. The strike price is also 3,000. As time goes on over 50 days, let's say nothing happens. In general, the option just decays with value over time due to Theta Decay. In the second case, we have is kind of the, I guess the metaphor here would be in Uniswap, you have 2 tokens, let's say X and Y, or A and B. And as you're trading them, one increases, one decreases, it's kind of like a water flow. And so in our case, for the sake of simplicity, let's say somebody decides to buy, keep slowly buying 10% of the option. So we start off with an option pool, which has, let's say, 100 tokens of these put options. And on the other hand, we have, let's say, a stablecoin pool. So as people buy, let's say, for the sake of simplicity, options, every time they buy an option, they obviously also have to pay for it. And as they buy it, the stablecoin pool increases. Note, though, the interesting property that as there's like a straight continuous buying of the option, the stablecoin actually slowly starts to doesn't diagonally just increase, it slightly decays. And this is primarily due to the phenomenon of theta decay, which is options actually become worth less as time goes on. This, of course, results in different changes for LPs. So there is a shift in the option pool. There's a shift in theta decay, and that results in just impermanent gain for the LP. And on the total fee side, we just set a fee of just, let's say, 3% for the sake of simplicity. The fee also continues to increase, and it is dependent on the option price. So as the option price actually decreases, the fee also decreases per unit, so to speak. And this may have interesting positive consequences, actually, if it goes the other way, which is, what if an option actually does not go in your favor and it actually is expiring in the money? Well, the option is worth more, but the fees that you won't be able to earn through the trading of such an option also increase. So these are kind of the 6 charts that we're going to look over in a more broad simulation. And I know it looks at first a bit daunting, but don't worry, I'll just walk through each and every one of these for the sake of explaining them. So what we have is we have the same 6 charts, only this time, last time we had just a very simple example of just one path. Now let's do 10,000 different paths, and let's just see what happens. We have 10,000 different options. Right now, the price of, let's say, Ethereum is 3,000, strike price 3,000, time to expiry 30. I think implied volatility was around 120% when I said it. And let's start with just the left one. We do not take any particular bias into where the price of Ethereum goes. Maybe it goes up, maybe it goes down. 10,000 different simulations, there's no particular direction that we take. Some of it may go up, some may go down. On average, you get a straight black line. That's the average of all the 10,000 paths. That's about pretty much 3,000. So some options may expire very deep in the money. Some options may expire very deep out of the money. So if we look, for example, at our put option, and we look at all these 10,000 different paths, and we ask ourselves, well, what happens to the value of such an option? Well, in general, you can see, observe how they kind of drift slowly closer to most of them to zero. There's like this negative drifting trend. And that's usually what happens with most options, which is, remember, the theta decay, the extrinsic value shrinks, and most options lose value over time. So they're kind of like insurance. And as time goes on, theta decay takes shape, and in general, if you were to do a distribution of how these wind up, most of them wind up in zero, and some of them wind up as you approach the time to expiry being valued more. So what happens to the AMM? In our case, what we have is another also stochastic simulation here going on, and that is a stochastic simulation of the buying and selling inside of the AMM itself. So at event 0, the options are merely just created, but at the next event, n+1, a liquidity pool is, let's say, created, where these options can be traded inside the AMM. And as they take shape, what we have is a kind of a negative, slightly negatively drifting option pool balance. And the reason for it is that we, in general, foresee that there's going to be just a slightly more demand for option buying than there is for option selling in general. So more people will actually prefer, by about 10% more, will prefer to buy options rather than sell them. And this creates the following interesting dynamic also for total balance B, which is the balance of stablecoins, which is, remember, as people buy more options, they have to pay for those options. And as they pay for those options, they fill up the stablecoin balance. And as that happens, notice that the same phenomenon happens over time, which is they kind of flatten out. And the reason is because the option value also drifts downwards with time, and as a result, the stablecoin pool doesn't fill up as much. And these dynamics, both the changes in the theta decay and the changes in the buying and selling on the AMM itself, create a certain impermanent gain or loss. And remember, we look at this just without the fees. We want to look at the fees separately. So what happens in this case? Well, on average, you would kind of get an impermanent gain, but then notice the widening distribution of it. So you have the 95% confidence intervals in the dotted black lines. You also have events where it can go as far as 10% and as little as 5%. So these are extreme cases that may also take place because crypto is a volatile asset in general. But one of the things that can help alleviate the pressure, let's say if you wind up in a closer to the impermanent loss scenario, like below the 95% confidence interval, is one of the things that can help out is things like fees. And as people are trading in the AMM, I want to talk a bit about how fees can help and why they kind of matter. And we spent some time just thinking about fees and dynamics of fees. How could we improve and make it fair for both sides in terms of trading? So fees can help out. So let me just talk a bit about fees. So like in traditional finance, what you have is the fees, they just kind of get eaten up. And in DeFi, these fees, they can help cushion you against situations of impermanent loss. And in particular, the interesting property of options is that as options go in the money and you wind up in a negative situation as, let's say, a liquidity provider or a short seller, what may happen is as the option goes in the money, or as it closer approaches at the money, its value goes up. And what happens is, since fees are a percentage of the price of, so to speak, the transaction, an option is valued more, then the fee value can be higher. So as an interesting example, if you look at the right here, we have is a graph of where most of the fees would kind of be generated in traditional finance. What you're looking at is the SPY ETF. It is one of the most popular, most liquid option series traded today. And if you notice where most of the volume is generated, and it's actually happening pretty much close to at the money, expiring about like, let's say, 2 weeks out. So, or unless they're like highly unique events, like let's say Federal Reserve meetings or something like that, there may be a lot of volume happening at those events. So what's happening is as you approach at the money and at the expiration date, most of the trading is going to be going on. So if one were to target fee, let's say maximization, one would aim for riskier at the money strike prices that can help generate this. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. If you, for example, write a very deep out of the money option, as you can see, most people would not be interested in trading those. But if you have them closer to at the money and at the expiration, that's where most of the volume takes shape. So what's going on here is in traditional financial markets, whenever fees, the fees are, so to speak, not shared with you, but in DeFi, we think it's just important that the people who take the risk should be the ones primarily rewarded. So we think that the fees should primarily just go to the LPs in general. So one of the things that we also noticed as we were testing and experimenting with fees is this idea of attempts that we've seen in traditional financial markets where people try to manipulate the market. In particular, options markets, in particular things like the VIX, the Volatility Index. For example, somebody might try and purposefully, on Wednesday, for example, the VIX expires, and somebody might try and spike the VIX by buying deep out of the money, let's say, calls on some unknown S&P 500 stock. As a result, the VIX might actually slightly expire, like slightly might go up at the last expiration date. And we want to prevent that kind of behavior. So one of the things that we introduced is this concept of dynamic fees. And its primary purpose is to protect, let's say, LPs if people try and manipulate prices, and to discourage manipulation. And if there is manipulation, what's going to happen is dynamic fees would increase, and as a result, they would just go to LPs. So if somebody's trying to purposefully, let's say, change the price of the option. So let's do an interesting kind of example with Matic put options, because what we did is we did an experiment with these. So thank you. I guess some of you might have been our test subjects, I guess. So we looked at Matic put options. And then, for example, there was a particular interesting event. And this is the event when, so to speak, dynamic fees were triggered. So let me kind of talk about these. So what we had is we had a Matic put option. There was an LP position that lasted over 10 days. If you look at the top left, figure 7A, we had the price of Matic, which is a Polygon layer 2. And, pardon? We had a figure 7A, the price of Matic. And let's say it started off at around $2. And as time went on, over the course of about 450 events, which lasted over 10 days, so about 450 events of interaction with our AMM, the price of Matic went from all the way around $2, very far out of the money, to very deep in the money of about 1.4. So here's an interesting phenomenon. And remember, the option itself is made up of kind of two components, as we said in the beginning, the intrinsic component and the extrinsic component. And we can subtract one from the other to kind of see how they behave. So notice the option value kind of moves around. There's a quick spike, and then a decay in extrinsic value. But in the very last moment, the option expires in the money, and there's actually a spike in intrinsic value. So the option went from around 0.22 cents, and an incredibly, it's an incredibly cheap option. It went to 0.30 cents. One of the interesting things is I want to mention with pods is that we can provide, you can buy fractions of an option. So if one option is worth 0.20 cents, then you can buy like 1/100th, and it would be like 0.02 cents, I don't know. So you can buy very, very small fractional amounts. That is also available. So we may use this as an experiment test bed to see how people behave and stuff like that. And what we noticed is the following interesting dynamic observed in figure 7c. This is the implied volatility. And what happened is extrinsic value spiking at around event 50. So notice how the underlying did not change that much around event 50, but the price of the option did spike. So it's very peculiar when this happened. It means somebody was buying a tremendously huge amount of options at that interval. Maybe somebody did it on purpose, maybe by accident, maybe a whale or a degen, I don't know. And as that happened, it spiked the price of the option. But as it did that, if somebody was on purpose trying to manipulate it, it also spiked the dynamic fees. So what this means is that the fees that were earned weren't just from regular trading, but also from dynamic fees. And pretty much the majority of the fees that were generated here were because of this, whether conscious or unconscious event that took place. So that is a very interesting observation. And what you notice is implied volatility kind of just declined over time, was slightly fluctuating in the beginning and just declined over time. And the fees were just slowly accumulated as trading takes place. And there's the metric of impermanent gain that we looked into for the liquidity providers. So the initial liquidity provider actually winded up starting with, and it ranges from, our liquidity provider impermanent gain is a particular term that we use. It's called the pool value factor, so to speak, which is denoted FIMP. We kind of track it in our white paper, mentioned in our white paper. It primarily, all it does is it tracks impermanent gain without factoring into account the fees. So we can just look at it separately. And what happened for the liquidity provider in this experiment is the person started off slowly.
Nice.
Yes. So people, there was slowly increasing, but then you had a rapid move in the money, and there was a loss, but the person winded up in a more of an impermanent gain position by slightly increased by like 2%. So there was an impermanent gain without fees of about 2% for the LP, and this primarily stems from the fact that a couple of dynamics took place, which is while at first there was theta decay, implied volatility was in the beginning higher. And as it was higher, if you are an LP, and if you are, for example, if you are short options, what you want to do is you want to sell options at a higher implied volatility. Because if you have a higher implied volatility, the price of the option is higher and it slowly decays, and there's more to decay, so to speak, as time goes on. But if you underprice your option, you may be in a more negative scenario. So as you can see, that there's these behaviors of how theta decays over time, whether an option is in the money, at the money, out of the money. So I think that this is a very interesting example that we have of the behavior of our AMM, where we have extremes in all cases. We have extremes where an option is very far out of the money, goes all the way in the money. We have an option that's stable, that's kind of stable, and then on the last day, bam, goes straight up. We have cases where fees just go berserk. We have cases where implied volatility is extreme. We have an interesting case where implied and permanent gain, you wind up actually with a permanent gain. So this is like a very interesting extreme scenario of how our AMM behaves live. So that's kind of my presentation. And Bobby, I don't know if you're still here. So I know you wanted to mention some stuff.
Yeah.
Guys, can you hear me?
Yeah, no, for sure. No, don't worry. I think that you did a really great cover on the pricing method.
Pardon?
I'm sorry.
We can hear you, Bobby.
Oh, I think someone is not muted. Just a sec. Well, so as I was saying, I think that Vasily, you did a great cover on our model and the pricing and the simulations. Honestly, I don't have anything to add at the moment. Like I'm curious to see if there's any particular question or a specific theme or topic that the community would like us to go over or get into more detail. But yeah, other than that, like really great presentation. So thank you for preparing this for today. Thank you, Joey, for the comment. Oh, and also thank you all.
I'm kind of stuck in this one
for being here.
I don't know how to exit
today.
this window.
Eddie, were you saying something?
Oh no, I was just going to say that we are recording this presentation. We're gonna upload on YouTube, and for this presentation, we kind of cover the results, the economic scenarios, and the next one, it would be nice to cover like the metrics itself, like the minimums and stuff. The tool, like the mechanism of the AMM itself. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're also curious to hear if there's any specific topic that we should do a specific community call for.
Yeah. Claude sent a question. Yeah, in the general group.
Mm-hmm. So his question is about liquidity providers' shares. So in Uniswap, when you provide liquidity, you receive like LP tokens. In our case, the way that we are set up in our code, what you could get is an NFT for your position, but not necessarily a ERC20 for the position. Maybe either Vasily or Rob want to comment on this?
Yeah. So what's happening is when you interact with the AMM and you deposit, let's say options. Let me think of an example. When you deposit some options in stablecoins, we have an easier way of doing it where you can just deposit. We have a Zap which just allows you to deposit money, just stablecoins, and then we internally solve this part for you. We can allocate, let's say, 50% to options, 50% to stablecoins. And when we do that, as time goes on, we track this thing, this ERC20, known as an FM. We track this thing internally known as an FM, the pool value factor. This little thing right here. And it's basically your impermanent gain. And it tracks it for everybody. So instead of an approach that Uniswap uses, which is you have some kind of an LP token, you have a particular struct that just tracks your position in basically the smart contract. So that's how it works. Yeah. We don't create LP tokens. And one of the reasons is, maybe Rock would talk about this, but this is primarily for more architectural purposes later on, because we want to enable people to use and build on top of these options, other like synthetic instruments and stuff like that. And there were certain architectural sacrifices, decisions that had to be made to make this. So if Rob wants to talk about or Guy to better explain this concept.
Yeah, actually, like Claude, the question is good. In the first moment, the system was complex enough in order to tokenize the LP position, especially because our LP position is an NFT, meaning like is a non-fungible position similar to Uniswap v3. By the moment that we did the code, Uniswap v3 was releasing. So this creating the LP position as an NFT was like something new that we didn't know if the market was going to accept. Now that we are more used to this, we are thinking on landing the possibility of tokenizing the LP position in a future version. So it was like we wanted to simplify the system in the beginning.
Also guys, fine, just a reminder here, I'm gonna send the code for you guys at the end, the PWAP bot so that you can redeem your PWAP for this community call. I think it's easier for you guys to redeem it by yourselves. I'm gonna send it in the events channel. So yeah. Anyone has any other question? I'm sorry, I might have muted some of you guys during during the call, but I unmuted everyone. So if you want to just jump in and ask.
Big Brain is asking about Kyber dynamic market maker.
Market maker.
I remember to take a look when we were architecturing. I remember that we saw Kyber approach, and that was part of our conversations. But right now, I can't remember exactly what are the parts that we found interesting.
I'm not super versed in the Kyber model either. Big Brain, maybe you want to give some context on the specific part that you think makes sense for us to review, or I don't know, research.
Yeah, so that's kind of, I'll stop sharing my screen. But if you guys have any questions, feel